A wolf doesn't disappear from a locked house unless it was never just a wolf. Emily Carter woke with a sharp breath and stared at the dark stain on her pillow. For a moment, she thought she was still dreaming. The small cabin was silent except for the crackling of dying embers in the stone fireplace. Outside, the winter wind whispered through the pine trees that surrounded her home. The storm that had swept across the valley during the night had finally passed, leaving the world buried beneath fresh snow. Emily pushed herself upright. Her blonde hair fell over her shoulders as her eyes fixed on the crimson mark soaking into the white pillowcase. Her heart stumbled. The wounded wolf. Instantly, she turned toward the bed. Empty. The massive black wolf she had brought inside the night before was gone. The blankets were twisted. The mattress still carried the impression of a large body that had rested there only hours ago. But the wolf itself had vanished. Emily swallowed hard and swung her feet onto the wooden floor. The cabin suddenly felt much larger than it had before. Colder too. She crossed the room and touched the blanket. It was still warm. Somehow that made her even more uneasy. Slowly, she looked toward the front door. It remained shut. The iron latch was exactly where she had left it before falling asleep. Locked from the inside. Her brows pulled together. That wasn't possible. She remembered every detail from the previous evening. The freezing wind. The lonely walk home after the winter gathering. The whispers that followed her through the village square. Poor Omega. Unwanted Omega. The words still echoed in her memory like old scars refusing to fade. Nobody had invited her to sit near the great bonfire. Nobody had asked her to dance. By the time she left, most people had forgotten she was even there. Then, on the path leading through the forest, she had found the wolf. Alone, injured, exhausted. Its dark fur had been covered with snow, and its silver eyes had watched her with a mixture of caution and pain. Every sensible person would have reported it. Strange wolves near pack territory were considered dangerous. But Emily had never been good at turning away from suffering. So she had carried water, gathered bandages, lit her fireplace. She had even given up her own bed. A faint smile touched her lips despite her confusion. "I hope you're okay," she whispered into the empty room. Her voice sounded strangely loud. The cabin offered no answer. Then something caught her eye. Near the bed stood a small object resting on the floorboards. Emily stepped closer and bent down. It was a black feather, long perfectly smooth. Unusual. She picked it up carefully. A chill ran down her spine. Wolves didn't leave feathers behind. Before she could think further, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed through the quiet morning. Emily froze. Hoofbeats. Several of them. Approaching fast. She moved toward the frost-covered window and peeked outside. Her breath caught. Riders were emerging from the forest. Not villagers. Not hunters. Their dark cloaks carried the silver crest of the royal kingdom, and they were heading directly toward her cabin. Emily stepped back from the window as the riders emerged from the curtain of snow-covered pines. There were at least 8 of them, mounted on powerful horses draped in dark leather tack marked with silver crests. Even from a distance, she recognized the symbol, the royal crown of the northern kingdom. Her pulse quickened. Royal riders never came to her part of the valley, not for someone like her. The hoofbeats grew louder until they finally slowed in front of the cabin. Frost clung to the horses' coats. Their riders sat tall and alert, scanning the area as though searching for something precious that had been lost. Emily tightened her grip on the black feather still resting in her hand. A knock echoed through the cabin door. Firm, controlled, not threatening, but impossible to ignore. Emily hesitated before unlatching the door. The icy morning air rushed inside immediately. Standing on the porch was a broad-shouldered man with dark hair touched by silver at the temples. His sharp gray eyes studied her carefully. Behind him, the other riders waited in silence. "Miss Emily Carter?" he asked. She nodded cautiously. "Yes." Relief flickered across the stranger's face. "Thank the moon. We finally found this place." Emily frowned. "Found it for what?" The man glanced over her shoulder toward the interior of the cabin. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. "May I ask if anyone else is inside?" Instinctively, Emily thought of the wolf. The empty bed. The blood on the pillow. "No," she answered. "Just me." The rider seemed disappointed by the answer. For several long seconds, he appeared to weigh his next words carefully. "Did you happen to see anything unusual last night?" Emily almost laughed at the question. Everything about last night had been unusual. the storm, the wolf, the feather, the locked door. But something told her not to reveal everything yet. I saw a storm, she replied softly. The man studied her face as though searching for hidden meaning. Then another rider approached from behind. He was younger, perhaps no older than 30, with a worried expression. Commander Hayes, he said quietly. The tracks end here exactly as reported. Emily's attention sharpened. Tracks? Commander Hayes exhaled slowly and turned back toward her. Miss Carter, please forgive the intrusion. We are searching for someone important. Someone, Emily repeated. I thought you were tracking an animal. The two men exchanged a glance. For the briefest moment, neither answered. Then Commander Hayes smiled politely. Sometimes the difference is not as simple as people think. A chill slipped down Emily's spine. Before she could respond, one of the horses suddenly lifted its head and whinnied. Every rider became alert. Their attention shifted toward the forest. The trees stood silent beneath the pale morning sunlight. Nothing moved. Yet the atmosphere changed instantly, as though someone unseen had entered the clearing. Emily followed their gaze. Her breath caught. Standing at the edge of the forest, half hidden among the pines, was a tall figure dressed entirely in black. Snow drifted around him in the cold morning air. She could not make out his face from this distance, but she could see one unmistakable detail. His eyes, bright silver, the exact same eyes that had watched her from the bed the night before. Emily could not breathe. The world seemed to narrow until there was nothing left except those silver eyes standing beyond the snow-covered trees. Every instinct inside her recognized them. She had seen them only hours ago reflecting firelight from the edge of her bed. The tall stranger remained motionless, his dark coat shifting gently in the winter breeze. Around her, the royal riders immediately straightened in their saddles. Commander Hayes released a slow breath that sounded remarkably like relief. Thank the moon, he murmured. Several riders lowered their heads respectfully. Emily noticed the gesture at once. Whoever stood at the edge of the forest was not an ordinary man. The stranger finally stepped forward. Snow crunched softly beneath his boots as he crossed the clearing. His movements carried an effortless confidence that seemed completely natural, as though the world itself adjusted around him. Emily's pulse quickened with every step he took. Up close, he appeared even taller than she had imagined. Dark hair brushed the collar of his coat. His features were sharp and calm, yet it was his eyes that held her attention. Bright silver, unmistakable, familiar. He stopped a few feet away and looked directly at her. For a moment, neither spoke. Emily felt as though he were studying every detail about her, not with judgment, but with quiet curiosity. Then his gaze shifted toward the black feather still clutched in her hand. Something warm flickered across his expression. You kept it, he said softly. The sound of his voice sent a shiver through her. She knew that voice too, not from words spoken aloud, but from the strange sense of comfort she had felt beside the wolf during the night. Emily tightened her fingers around the feather. Who are you? She asked. The question escaped before she could stop herself. The riders exchanged nervous glances. Commander Hayes looked as though he wanted to intervene, but the stranger lifted a hand slightly. The entire group fell silent. Someone who owes you a debt, he answered. Emily frowned. You were in my cabin. It was not a question. The faintest smile touched his face. I was. Her heart pounded. The impossible truth stood right in front of her, and yet her mind struggled to accept it. She remembered the warm fur beneath her hands, the tired eyes watching her from the bed, the wolf that should not have disappeared from a locked cabin. The wolf, she whispered. His smile deepened almost imperceptibly. Yes. Emily stared at him. Every thought scattered like leaves in a storm. Before she could form another question, movement appeared at the far end of the clearing. Villagers were approaching. Curious faces emerged from between the cabins. News traveled quickly in a small valley. People had already noticed the royal riders. Within minutes, more residents gathered nearby. Emily recognized many of them. Some were the same people who had ignored her at the winter gathering. Some were the same people who rarely looked at her at all. Now every eye was fixed on her front yard. The stranger glanced toward the growing crowd. His expression became unreadable. Then he looked back at Emily. It seems, he said quietly, that our conversation is about to become much more complicated. The clearing grew more crowded with every passing minute. Villagers gathered near the road, whispering among themselves as they stared at the royal riders standing outside Emily Carter's cabin. She could feel their attention pressing against her from every direction. People who had barely spoken to her in months suddenly seemed fascinated by her existence. Emily lowered her eyes briefly, uncomfortable beneath so many curious stares. When she looked up again, the silver-eyed stranger was still watching her. Unlike everyone else, his gaze carried no judgment, only patience, as though he understood exactly how overwhelmed she felt. A familiar voice suddenly cut through the crowd. "Emily." She turned and immediately recognized Martha Green, the baker's wife. Martha pushed her way through the gathering villagers, clutching her shawl tightly against the winter air. "Are you all right?" she asked. Emily nodded. "I think so." Martha looked from Emily to the royal riders, and then to the dark-haired stranger. Her eyes widened. "What is happening here?" Emily wished she knew. Before she could answer, another villager stepped forward. Then another. Questions began spreading through the crowd faster than wildfire. Why were royal guards here? Who was the stranger? Why had they come to Emily's cabin of all places? The silver-eyed man remained calm throughout the growing commotion. Commander Hayes finally cleared his throat. "Please remain respectful," he said firmly. "His Majesty requires a moment of privacy." Silence fell instantly. Emily blinked. "His Majesty." Several villagers gasped. Others immediately lowered their heads. The stranger seemed almost annoyed by the reaction, as though he disliked the title. Emily stared at him in disbelief. Her thoughts froze. His Majesty. There was only one person in the Northern Kingdom addressed that way. Her gaze slowly lifted to meet his. The realization struck like a bolt of lightning. Alpha King Alexander Blackwood. The name existed in every story told around winter fires. The ruler who united the northern territories. The king whose wisdom was praised from one end of the kingdom to the other. The king she had somehow offered her bed to less than 12 hours ago. Heat flooded her face. "You are the Alpha King," she whispered. Alexander gave a small nod. "I am." Emily's heart nearly stopped. Every memory from the previous night rushed back at once. The bandages, the blanket, the bowl of soup she had left beside the bed, the way she had spoken freely in front of him without realizing who he was. She wanted the ground to open beneath her feet. Yet to her surprise, Alexander looked almost amused. "If it helps," he said quietly, "I preferred the way you treated me before you knew my name." Emily stared at him. For a second, she was not looking at a king. She was remembering a tired wolf resting beside the fire. A lonely creature that had needed help. Something softened inside her. The fear eased slightly. Then a movement near the back of the crowd caught Alexander's attention. His expression changed immediately. The warmth vanished. His silver eyes narrowed toward a figure standing partially hidden among the villagers. Whoever it was disappeared before Emily could identify them. But she noticed something unsettling. For the first time since arriving, the Alpha King looked concerned. The crowd remained frozen long after the mysterious figure disappeared into the sea of villagers. Emily could feel the tension settle over the clearing like a storm cloud. Alexander's attention lingered on the spot where the stranger had stood. His expression was calm again, but something in his eyes had changed. It reminded her of the way the wounded wolf had reacted during the night, whenever a distant sound echoed through the forest. Alert, watchful, ready. Commander Hayes stepped closer. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "perhaps we should continue this discussion elsewhere." Alexander gave a slight nod, but did not immediately move. Instead, he turned toward Emily. "May I ask you something?" The question surprised her. A king asking permission felt strange. "Of course," she answered. "Last night," Alexander said, "when you found me in the snow, why did you help?" Several villagers exchanged confused looks. Emily blinked. The answer seemed obvious. "Because you needed help." Alexander studied her face as if searching for a deeper explanation. "You knew I was a wolf from outside your pack." "Yes." "You knew I could have been dangerous." "Maybe." "You knew nobody would blame you for walking away." Emily looked down at the feather still resting in her hand. The smooth black surface caught the winter sunlight. "I know what it feels like when people decide you are not worth stopping for," she said quietly. Silence spread through the clearing. Nobody spoke. Emily was not even sure why she had said it aloud. Perhaps because it was true. She had spent years being overlooked, forgotten, judged before anyone bothered to know her. The thought of leaving an injured creature alone in the snow had felt impossible. Alexander's gaze softened. "So you helped because you were kind?" Emily shook her head. "No. I helped because it was the right thing to do. Something almost like admiration flickered across his face. Around them, the villagers began whispering again. This time the whispers sounded different. Less dismissive, more uncertain. Martha Green wiped at her eyes. Several others looked away uncomfortably. For the first time, Emily realized that people were listening to her words. Really listening. Then a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing. Snow drifted from the rooftops. One of the royal horses became restless. Commander Hayes glanced toward the forest line. We should leave soon, he said. The roads will become difficult again before sunset. Alexander nodded. Agreed. Emily expected that to be the end of it. The king would return to his palace. The riders would disappear. Life would somehow return to normal. Yet deep down she already knew normal was gone. Alexander stepped closer. Not enough to make her uncomfortable, but close enough that she could see tiny flecks of silver hidden within his eyes. Miss Carter, he said, there is something else I need to show you. Before she could respond, he reached into the inside pocket of his dark coat and withdrew a small object wrapped in black cloth. The moment Emily saw it, her breath caught. It was identical to the feather in her hand. And unlike the first one, this feather glowed faintly beneath the winter sunlight. Emily stared at the glowing feather in Alexander's hand. The soft silver light pulsed beneath the dark strands as though it carried a heartbeat of its own. Around them, the crowd fell silent once again. Even the winter wind seemed to pause. What is it? Emily asked quietly. Alexander looked down at the feather before returning his gaze to her. A sign that should not exist. The answer only deepened her confusion. Commander Hayes shifted uneasily beside him. Several royal riders exchanged worried glances. Clearly, they understood something she did not. Alexander carefully unfolded the black cloth completely, revealing the feather's full length. It was nearly a foot long and impossibly smooth. Tiny streaks of silver shimmered through the dark surface like moonlight trapped inside obsidian glass. Emily looked at the feather in her own hand. The resemblance was undeniable. They are identical, she whispered. Almost, Alexander replied. He slowly stepped closer and held the glowing feather beside hers. The moment the two feathers neared each other, a faint warmth spread through Emily's fingers. She gasped softly. The silver light brightened. Tiny sparks drifted between the feathers before fading into the cold air. A murmur swept through the villagers. Martha Green crossed herself. Someone whispered a prayer. Emily's heart raced. How is that possible? Alexander's expression grew thoughtful. For generations, stories spoke of a rare bond between compassion and destiny. Most people dismissed them as myths. And you do not? She asked. I stopped dismissing them this morning. His answer left her speechless. The king carefully wrapped the glowing feather again and tucked it inside his coat. Then his gaze drifted toward the cabin. May I see where you found me? Emily blinked. Inside, if you do not mind. She hesitated only briefly before nodding. Together they walked toward the cabin. The villagers watched with open fascination. Nobody attempted to follow. Commander Hayes remained outside with the riders while Alexander entered the small home behind Emily. The warmth of the fireplace greeted them immediately. Everything looked exactly as it had earlier. The empty bed, the folded blankets, the blood-stained pillow. Alexander paused beside the bed. His silver eyes lingered on the pillowcase. A strange expression crossed his face. Gratitude. Emily had not expected that. You should have rested here yourself, he said quietly. She shrugged. You needed it more. Alexander looked at her. You did not know who I was. That did not matter. For a moment neither spoke. The fire crackled softly between them. Then Alexander noticed the bowl resting near the fireplace. The unfinished soup she had left during the night. A faint smile touched his face. That soup was terrible. Emily stared at him in shock. Then, despite everything, she laughed. The sound escaped before she could stop it. Alexander laughed too. Briefly, warmly. The moment felt strangely normal. Almost peaceful. Then a loud shout echoed from outside. The laughter vanished instantly. Commander Hayes burst through the door, breathing hard. Your Majesty, he said urgently. We found him. Alexander's expression darkened. Where? Hayes glanced toward the window, watching the cabin, just beyond the tree line. Emily felt the warmth drain from the room. Commander Hayes rarely looked unsettled, yet now concern was written plainly across his face. Alexander remained perfectly still for several seconds. The fire crackled softly behind him, but the peaceful atmosphere from moments earlier had completely vanished. Are you certain? Alexander asked. Hayes nodded. 100% certain. He was positioned beyond the eastern tree line overlooking the cabin. One of our scouts recognized him before he disappeared. Emily looked between them. Who is he? Neither man answered immediately. That silence worried her more than any explanation could have. Alexander finally turned toward her. Someone who should not be here. Emily folded her arms against the chill that suddenly seemed to fill the cabin. That is not much of an answer. To her surprise, Alexander almost smiled. No, it is not. Hayes stepped closer. Your Majesty, we should return to the capital immediately. Not yet. The answer came without hesitation. Hayes looked frustrated. Sir, with respect, not yet, Alexander repeated. His voice remained calm, but it carried a quiet authority that ended the discussion. Hayes lowered his head. As you wish. Emily watched the exchange carefully. She did not know much about kings, but she knew enough to recognize trust. Hayes was worried because he genuinely cared what happened to Alexander. That realization made the situation feel even more serious. Alexander walked toward the window and looked outside. Villagers still filled the clearing. Children stood on fences trying to catch glimpses of the royal visitors. Older residents whispered among themselves. The entire valley seemed captivated by the unexpected arrival. The person outside, Emily said softly. Does he have something to do with the feather? Alexander glanced at her. Perhaps. You keep giving answers that create more questions. This time he actually laughed. A genuine laugh. Brief but real. I suppose I do. Emily found herself smiling despite everything. Then Alexander's expression grew thoughtful again. The feather is connected to an old story. What kind of story? The kind people stop believing after enough years pass. Emily leaned against the wooden table. Try me. For a moment he seemed to debate whether to continue. Finally he spoke. Long ago, before the kingdom was united, there were said to be rare individuals whose kindness could awaken forgotten magic. Emily blinked. Kindness. Not power. Not status. Not strength. Kindness. He looked directly at her. Most people considered the stories nonsense. Emily stared at the feather still resting in her hand. The faint warmth had never completely faded. And now, she asked. Alexander's silver eyes softened. Now I am not so sure. A sudden knock interrupted them. Martha Green appeared hesitantly in the doorway carrying a basket covered with a cloth. I am sorry to interrupt, she said nervously, but I thought everyone might be hungry. Emily immediately recognized the basket. Fresh bread. Martha's best bread. The baker's wife walked straight toward Alexander and stopped. Your Majesty. Alexander accepted the basket with a grateful nod. Thank you. Martha smiled before turning to Emily. And thank you too. Emily frowned. For what? Martha's eyes became suspiciously bright. For reminding the rest of us what compassion looks like. Before Emily could respond, a brilliant silver glow suddenly burst from the feather in her hand, filling the entire room with light. The silver light filled every corner of the cabin, washing across the wooden walls and reflecting in the wide eyes of everyone present. Martha gasped and nearly dropped the basket she was carrying. Commander Hayes froze in the doorway. Even Alexander looked surprised. Emily stared down at the feather in her hand. The glow was no longer faint. It pulsed steadily, almost as if it were responding to something deep inside her. The warmth spread from her fingertips through her arms and into her chest. Yet it did not hurt. If anything, it felt comforting, familiar, like sunlight after a long winter. What is happening? Emily whispered. No one answered immediately. Alexander stepped closer, his attention fixed entirely on the feather. The silver light reflected in his eyes, making them appear brighter than ever. I have only read about this, he said quietly. I never expected to see it. Emily looked up. See what? Alexander hesitated. For the first time since arriving, he seemed uncertain. Recognition. The word hung in the air. Martha frowned. Commander Hayes looked confused. Emily felt even more lost than before. Recognition of what? She asked. Alexander reached into his coat and removed the second feather. The moment he uncovered it, the glow intensified. Both feathers responded instantly, their silver light intertwining like threads woven together by an invisible hand. A collective gasp filled the room. Outside, several villagers pressed closer to the windows, trying to see what was happening. The old stories, Alexander said softly, claimed that certain gifts could only awaken in the presence of someone whose heart remained unchanged by bitterness. Emily blinked. I do not understand. A sad smile touched his face. Most people who are overlooked eventually stop caring about others. They become angry, guarded, hardened. His gaze remained steady on hers. You did not. The room grew quiet. Emily thought about the years she had spent being ignored. The celebrations where nobody invited her to join them. The conversations that stopped whenever she approached. The countless times people had decided who she was before learning anything about her. She had every reason to become bitter. Yet somehow she never had. Not completely. I only did what anyone should do, she said. Alexander slowly shook his head. That is exactly the problem. Before she could ask what he meant, Commander Hayes suddenly moved toward the window. His expression darkened. Your Majesty. Alexander turned immediately. What is it? Hayes pointed outside. The villagers. Emily followed their gaze. More people had arrived. Nearly the entire valley now stood beyond the cabin. But something felt different. The expressions she saw were no longer filled with curiosity alone. There was wonder there. Respect. Several people lowered their heads when they noticed her looking. Emily's breath caught. These were the same people who had barely acknowledged her existence yesterday. Martha gently placed a hand on her shoulder. They see you now, she whispered. Emily felt tears sting her eyes. Not because of the attention, not because of the glowing feather, but because for the first time in years, she believed Martha might be right. Then, beyond the gathered crowd, a distant figure appeared at the edge of the forest once more. This time the stranger did not hide, and when Alexander saw him, every trace of warmth vanished from his face. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Emily followed Alexander's gaze toward the figure standing at the edge of the forest. Unlike before, the stranger made no effort to hide. He stood calmly among the snow-covered pines, watching the cabin with an expression that was impossible to read from this distance. The crowd noticed him as well. Conversations faded into uneasy silence. Commander Hayes stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Alexander and the window. He wants to be seen now, Hayes said quietly. Alexander nodded once. Yes. Emily looked from one man to the other. Who is he? This time Alexander answered. An old guardian. The response surprised everyone. Hayes looked confused. Martha blinked. Even Emily had expected something far more threatening. A guardian? She repeated. Alexander's eyes never left the distant figure. According to the oldest records, there were once people entrusted with watching over certain gifts when the world forgot they existed. Emily lowered her gaze to the glowing feather in her hand. The silver light continued to pulse softly. And he is watching me? I believe so. Before Emily could process that answer, something unexpected happened. The stranger at the tree line slowly raised his hand. Not a warning, not a threat, a greeting. Then he smiled. The expression carried a strange warmth that instantly eased the tension in the room. Emily felt the feather grow warmer. The silver glow brightened one final time before gradually settling into a gentle radiance. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time all day. Golden beams spilled across the valley, turning the snow into a field of diamonds. The villagers looked around in wonder. Children laughed and pointed toward the sky. Martha smiled through her tears. Commander Hayes finally relaxed. And for the first time since arriving, Alexander looked completely at peace. Emily stepped outside the cabin. The cold air touched her cheeks, but she barely noticed. Every eye in the valley followed her movement. Yesterday, she had walked through these same streets unseen. Today, people looked at her differently. Not because of the feather, not because of the king, but because they had finally witnessed the truth of who she was. A young girl from the crowd suddenly approached. Emily recognized her as the daughter of a local carpenter. The child offered a shy smile. My mother says you are brave. Emily felt her throat tighten. She knelt slightly, so they were eye level. Your mother is very kind. The girl shook her head. No. She says kindness is what made you brave. Emily looked up and saw several villagers nodding in agreement. Tears threatened to return. Alexander stepped beside her. His dark coat moved gently in the breeze. You changed something here today, he said. Emily laughed softly. I only helped someone who needed help. Exactly, Alexander replied. For a moment, they stood together beneath the winter sunlight. The distant guardian remained at the edge of the forest, watching silently. Then, as quietly as he had appeared, he turned and disappeared among the trees. Emily expected Alexander to look concerned. Instead, he smiled. "What now?" she asked. Alexander glanced toward the horizon where the clouds had finally begun to clear. "Now," he said, "you continue being exactly who you are." Emily looked down at the feather resting in her hand. Its silver glow had become steady and calm, like a promise. Around her, the valley felt brighter than it ever had before. And somewhere deep inside, she understood a simple truth. The kindness that had once made her invisible had become the very thing that allowed the world to finally see her.